Allison was in the armory, hands steady, working with surgical precision on the rifles. The smell of gun oil and solvent filled the room, familiar and grounding, but today it did nothing to calm the tension she had long learned to carry. Brian entered with 2 soldiers in tow, smirking, arrogance radiating off him like heat. He slammed a Pelican case onto her bench and leaned close, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hey cleaner, it's just a joke. Unless you think you can hit 3,500 meters. The words weren't just teasing, they were meant to humiliate, to remind her of the hierarchy he believed he owned. But Allison didn't flinch, her eyes locked on the target, calculation and instinct merging seamlessly. Years of SEAL training, countless long-range drills, and the quiet strength of a seasoned operator guided every movement. She fired. The shot flew true, hitting the mark with effortless precision. Brian froze, disbelief breaking across his face, his authority crumbling in an instant. From that moment, a fire of envy and hatred ignited in him, promising revenge. What he didn't know was that Allison had already anticipated his every move. She was patient, methodical, and brilliant, planning a counterstrike that would leave him powerless and exposed. How far would she go? How would Brian's obsession unravel? But before we dive deeper, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now, let's see how this story truly began. The smell of CLP and gun oil lived in the armory, a way dust lived in the desert, permanent, unavoidable. For most, it clawed at the sinuses and lingered in the throat. For Allison, it settled her breathing. It meant predictability, control, home. Her hands moved with quiet precision over the disassembled trigger group of an M4 carbine, fingertips darkened with carbon felling and solvent. Each motion was economical, almost surgical. She didn't glance at the schematic pinned to the wall. She didn't need to. Springs, pins, sear surfaces, she knew their tolerances by feel alone. A half-millimeter of resistance register immediately. Muscle memory corrected what eyes didn't need to see. She wore no trident, no ribbons, no name that meant anything to the men who passed through the armory. Just grease-stained coveralls and a faded namatag stitched over her chest. Maintenance. It was a word people looked past. That was the point. The armory door slammed open hard enough to rattle the racks. Sunlight cut across the concrete floor in a harsh diagonal, followed by 3 elongated shadows. Allison didn't look up. Her hands didn't pause. Brian stepped in first. He filled the doorway like he expected it to adjust around him. Tall, relaxed, the easy posture of someone who had spent years being deferred to. Tier 1 sniper, decorated, the kind of man who spoke softly because he was used to being obeyed. His mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. He dropped a Pelican case onto her workbench. The sound was deliberate, plastic on steel, loud in the confined space. "Bolt sticking again," he said. "Clean it. And don't strip anything this time. These rifles cost more than you make in a year, sweetheart." One of the men behind him snorted. Another shifted his weight, boots scraping concrete. Allison felt it more than heard it. "I'll have it ready by 1400, she said, voice flat, eyes still on the trigger group as she reseated the pin with a controlled press of her thumb. Brian leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the dust baked into his gear. He nodded toward the open range bay, where heat shimmered above the Nevada basin like a living thing. "We're pushing the new point for 08 JTAC today," he said. Trying to confirm hits past 3.5 clicks, edge of physics, a pause. A beat calculated to draw attention. He smirked. "Hey, cleaner. Just a joke. But think you could hit 3,500 meters. Maybe if you scrub hard enough, the bullet'll fly itself." The armory, and still, even the ventilation hum seemed to recede. Allison set her tool down with care, not slowly, not abruptly, precisely. She stood. The change in her posture was subtle but complete. Shoulders aligned, spine straight, weight balanced over the balls of her feet. It was the posture of someone who had made a decision long before this moment. She walked past Brian without brushing him, opened the Pelican case, and cleared the rifle in one fluid sequence. Mag seated out, chamber check, bolt locked back. Her movements were faster than his eyes expected, cleaner than his nerves liked. "Load 1, she said. Brian laughed, a short, uncertain sound, and did as told. The round slid home with a muted metallic click. Outside, Allison went prone in the dirt as if the position had been waiting for her. She ignored the wind flag snapping half-heartedly along the range. Her gaze tracked the mirage rolling across the basin, layers of distortion stacking and unstacking with the heat. She dialed elevation deliberately, clicks counted without looking. Her breathing slowed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, heart rate settling, steadying, dropping into a familiar rhythm. A spotter lay behind her, one of Brian's men. His earlier grin had vanished. He adjusted his glass, unsure whether he was supposed to be witnessing a joke or a mistake. "Shooter ready," Allison said. "Spotter ready," came the reply, quieter than before. She fired. The recoil drove into her shoulder, firm but controlled, the muzzle blast punching dust into the air. The rifle settled back into her body as if it belonged there. Flight time stretched, nearly 6 seconds, where nothing happened. The spotter leaned into his scope, breath held, jaw tightening. "Impact," he said, confirmed, center mass. No steel rang, no celebration followed, just the certainty of physics obeyed. Allison rose, dusting her hands against her thighs, and handed the rifle back. "You're overlubing the bolt," she said, her tone unchanged. "Dust turns oil into glue. Fix your maintenance, your groups will tighten." She walked back into the armory without waiting for a response. Brian remained where he was, fingers flexing once at his side, a faint tick jumping beneath his eye. The authority he carried had fractured, just enough to show the fault line beneath. The look on his face wasn't respect, it was hatred. By nightfall, the base no longer sounded the same. Voices carried farther, laughter cut short too quickly. Conversations dropped when certain people walked by. The story moved faster than official channels ever could, stripped down to fragments that grew sharper with repetition, the cleaner shot. 3.5 clicks, no wine call error. The words passed through corridors, motor pools, and briefing rooms like contraband. Each retelling sanded away doubt, leaving behind something uncomfortable, something no one had planned for. Brian sat alone at a corner table in the mess hall, tray untouched. Fluorescent lights washed the room in a pale, unforgiving white. His jaw worked slowly, teeth grinding once, then again. A tendon stood out along his neck as he stared at nothing in particular. "She got lucky," he said, barely loud enough for the words to exist. Mirage shift, spotter error. Across from him, no one answered. A fork paused halfway to a mouth to tables down. Someone coughed and stood, tray scraped clean, boots retreating faster than necessary. Brian's fingers curled around the edge of the table. The metal flexed slightly under the pressure. He loosened his grip, forced his shoulders down, inhaled through his nose. Control mattered, appearances mattered. But the image wouldn't leave him the way she'd handled the rifle, the absence of hesitation, the spotter's voice when the call came back confirmed, no uncertainty, no disbelief. Just acceptance. He knew better, that was the problem. The bass quieted after taps, but the silence carried weight now. Brian moved through it with purpose, choosing routes by habit rather than comfort. He avoided open corridors, paused once at a corner until a pair of junior enlisted passed, their conversation dying as soon as they saw him. He reached the armory access point and keyed in his credentials. The system hesitated just long enough to be noticed before granting entry. Temporary armory access, legacy permissions tied to his sniper billet, scheduled for review but never quite removed. The kind of oversight that survived on assumptions. The door sealed behind him with a muted hydraulic sigh. Inside, the air was cooler, denser with Olan solvent. Racks stood in perfect alignment, tools lay where they were meant to be. Order imposed through repetition. Brian moved quickly now. He stayed out of the center aisle, kept to the edges where cameras overlapped poorly. He knew their fields of view. He'd studied them once, out of boredom, out of habit. Tonight, the knowledge mattered. Allison's bench sat exactly as she'd left it. Clean, squared away. Not a single tool out of alignment. A discipline that felt intentional, almost pointed. Brian's mouth tightened. His gaze flicked once to the door, then back to the bench. The commander's sidearm rested there, field stripped and waiting for final inspection. Standard issue, but personally carried, trusted. Brian picked it up with gloved hands, his movements careful, practiced. He removed the firing pin assembly and held it up to the light. For a moment, he hesitated, his breathing slowed. He felt his pulse in his fingertips, a faint tremor he forced still by tightening his grip. This wasn't rage. It was correction, course adjustment. He applied pressure precise, minimal, a bend measured in fractions. Enough to compromise ignition under stress, enough to cause a failure that would never look intentional. Enough to point the finger at the only name stitched onto that bench. Maintenance. Brian reassembled the weapon, his hand steady again. He wiped it down, erasing prints, restoring the illusion of untouched order. When he set it back in place, it looked exactly as it had before. He stood there for a second longer than necessary, eyes fixed on the namatag sewn into the coveralls draped over the chair. Maintenance. The word felt like an insult now, or a threat. Brian turned off the bench light and slipped out the way he'd come, the door sealing behind him without protest. Outside, the night air felt thin. He drew it in and held it, jaw tightening once more before he let it go. By morning, the fault would surface, and it wouldn't be his. The next morning, Allison felt it before she consciously understood it. Her fingers brushed the firing pin as she completed the final inspection sequence, and the sensation registered wrong, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to trip an internal alarm she had learned to trust long ago. The metal resisted her touch in a way it shouldn't have. Not seized, not damaged. Alter. She didn't pause. Didn't look around. Her breathing remained even as she rotated the component once more between her fingertips, confirming what her nerves already knew, a microbend. Subtle, intentional. Allison lowered the pin back into the frame, then removed it again with the same unhurried economy. From the inner pocket of her coveralls, she produced a small roll wrapped in oilcloth, her personal kit. Unlocked, unmarked, she selected a spare firing pin, identical in spec, ran it once through her fingers, and seated it cleanly into place. No witnesses, no record, just correction. She reassembled the sidearm and set it on the bench, perfectly aligned, then wiped her hands on a rag already dark with solvent. Her face betrayed nothing. Only the faint tightening at the corner of her mouth suggested the calculation continuing behind her eyes. Footsteps approached. Commander Sterling entered the armory without announcement, his presence immediately changing the air in the room. He carried himself with the quiet weight of command, no hurry, no excess motion. His eyes moved constantly, taking in details most men ignore. Brian followed half a step behind, posture just a fraction too alert, his smile already in place. Brian hovered near the bench as Sterling reached for the pistol. "Sir," Brian said smoothly, "I'd recommend a thorough check. Maintenance has been distracted." The word hung there, dismissive, precise. Allison didn't look up. Sterling Field stripped the weapon with practiced hands, his movements economical, confident. He checked the slide rails, the trigger brake, the reset. He rolled the firing pin between his fingers, testing alignment by feel rather than sight. His brow creased for a moment, then smoothed. "Feels better than factory," he grunted. Brian blinked once. The smile froze, then recalibrated slowly to hide the flicker beneath it. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping once before settling. The trap collapsed without noise, without spectacle. Sterling didn't hand the pistol back right away. He studied Allison, instead her stance, the way she held herself at ease without slouching, the absence of reaction where others would have offered explanation or defense. "Grab your gear," Sterling said at last. "Urban evasion drill, sim rounds." He turned slightly, just enough for his gaze to include Brian. "Brian suggested you might have hidden skills." Brian's smile returned, sharper this time. It didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, sir," Allison replied, already moving. She secured the bench, locked her kit away, and retrieved her equipment without unnecessary motion. Her hands were steady, her breathing unchanged. Inside, timelines adjusted, angles shifted. Brian watched her with a fixed intensity, his fingers flexing once at his side before curling into a relaxed fist. The humiliation from the day before hadn't faded, it had hardened. He planned to break her. And as Allison followed them out of the armory, the echo of her boots measured and, unhurried against the concrete, she knew it. The kill house went dark without warning. Lights extinguished in unison, plunging the narrow corridor into shadows that smelled faintly of gun oil and rubber. The metallic echo of boots on the concrete floor slowed as men adjusted to the sudden void. SIM rounds were in play, but the tension was tangible. The illusion of danger was enough to sharpen reflexes to surgical precision. Each operator's training responded instinctively, muscles tensing, hands hovering near controls, eyes straining for familiar cues. Brian's team fumbled with NVG mounts, the night vision goggles awkward against helmets slicked with sweat. Hesitation was punished in milliseconds. The quiet shimmer of motion above them went unnoticed by some, but was impossible for the alert to ignore. Shadows danced along the beams, deliberate and fluid, weight measure and silent. One man yelped a sharp, startled sound followed by the tearing rip of goggles as they were wrenched from his face. He flailed briefly, caught by instinct before his balance betrayed him. Another felt the brush of chalk against his throat, a fleeting contact, precise and unnerving. His hands instinctively went to the point of contact, eyes wide behind dark lenses, the light snapped back on. Harsh fluorescence replaced darkness in an instant, revealing the aftermath with brutal clarity. Brian's team was disoriented, spread across the room in positions that marked them individually. Each man bore the silent signature of a precise hand stencil like marks from a controlled, targeted engagement with sim rounds. There was no panic, only the realization that control had shifted. Brian stood near the far wall, chest heaving just enough to betray the effort of maintaining composure. His eyes scanned the kill house, flicking over bodies, noting injuries, noting positions, calculating errors. Every twitch in a jaw, every narrowing of an eye, every micro-adjustment in stance was catalogued. He expected authority to be reflected in obedience. Instead, he saw compliance stripped bare and reordered by a single operator. Allison remained seated atop a stack of tires, her posture relaxed but not casual. Hands rested on her knees, fingers tracing imaginary lines along the worn rubber, a habit developed over countless drills. She exhaled, slow and measured, lips barely moving, eyes scanning the room with the patience of someone who had already anticipated every contingency. The corners of her mouth hinted at neither pride nor malice, only the satisfaction of precision executed with economy. Commander Sterling entered the room, file in hand. His eyes narrowed, scanning Allison with a practiced discretion, catching subtleties in her expression most would miss. He exhaled softly, then lowered the phone to his ear, voice hushed enough for only the secure line to carry. "Get me the redacted version," he whispered, his attention moving between Allison's calm figure and the disorder around her. His tone held no surprise, only acknowledgement of competence recognized in a place you could measure. Every measured breath, every subtle shift in weight, every glance conveyed a calculus deeper than immediate observation. Brian's jaw flexed once, his fingers twitched against his thigh, barely perceptible, registering tension in the room that wasn't his own. The plan he had meticulously constructed, controlled through hierarchy, through intimidation, had dissolved before it even reached full execution. He looked at Allison again, trying to read a trace of fatigue, a misstep, any breach. There was none, only certainty. The operators began regrouping, checking gear, cataloging positions, the dull metallic clanks of weapons striking the floor blending with the soft shuffle of boots. Each action was deliberate, disciplined, but Brian could not erase the imprint left on them, the silent acknowledgement that authority had been challenged and reordered in mere seconds. Allison slid gracefully from the tires, landing on the floor with the sound muted against concrete. Her boots left no mark, no telltale scuff. She retrieved a mat and pointer from her kit, scanning projected points of engagement, angles of approach. Nothing moved without her calculation. Nothing escaped her observation. Sterling's eyes lingered on her file again, then the floor, then back at Allison. The redacted document on his tablet would formalize what had already been executed in practice, a clean, precise control of chaos. And in that moment, Brian understood fully not all precision could be countered by rank, nor every plan measured by intent alone. Brian's breathing became shallow before he even realized it. The calculated veneer he wore all day cracked in microseconds. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, gloved hands trembling slightly, a tick pulsing at the corner of his eye. The kill house aftermath still replayed in his mind, every disciplined operator, every mark made without error. Control had slipped from him, and instincts screamed that failure demanded compensation. He moved fast, deliberately. Legacy credentials, long slated for decommission, but never removed, granted him access to the logistics server. Each keystroke was precise, yet his pulse betrayed him. He avoided logs where possible, ducked beneath automated monitoring, flinched once at the soft beep of an access confirmation. The digital landscape was sterile, clinical, but his mind injected urgency into every command, every click. Brian planted the evidence meticulously, a breadcrumb trail of manipulated files, falsified maintenance logs, and fabricated communications espionage, treason, enough to guarantee that the net would close around Allison before anyone could intervene. His movements were calm, almost rehearsed, but the underlying panic dictated the tempo. By mid-morning, military police arrived. Their boots echoed down the hallways as they escorted Allison from the armory. She walked without hesitation, hands loose at her sides, gaze focused slightly downward, observing angles, calculating space between officers, cataloging exits, yet her expression betrayed nothing. She didn't resist, not a twitch, not a single word of protest. The precision of her composure contrasted violently with Brian's inner chaos. As she passed him in the corridor, her eyes met his for a heartbeat, lips parted, voice low, almost imperceptible, yet enough to pierce the armor of his arrogance. "Check your zero. You're aiming at the wrong target." The phrase lingered in the air long after she was gone. Brian's head jerked slightly, the corner of his eye twitching again. The locker room was empty when he finally returned, lights humming overhead, metal lockers aligned in silent conformity. His hands moved almost mechanically as he opened his personal locker. Inside, surveillance photographs lay stacked neatly, evidence he hadn't anticipated. He picked up one, felt the gloss against his fingertips, and the image imprinted itself onto his cognition. Him, an arms dealer. 3 months prior, the lighting, the angle, the unmistakable details, everything recorded without error. The realization struck slowly at first, then with sudden clarity. The careful network of lies he had constructed, the manipulation of credentials, the digital breadcrumbs useless, the very evidence he had sought to weaponize against Allison now implicated him. His hands flexed once, twice, before closing into a fist at his side. The micro-movement of his jaw betrayed a barely suppressed curse. A bead of sweat traced down the temple beneath his helmet hair, unnoticed by anyone but him. The muscle along his forearm twitched as tension cold and uncoiled, a silent metronome to the storm he had unleashed upon himself. He sank onto the bench, leaning forward, elbows on knees, head hanging slightly. The photographs lay there, an accusation without words. His mind raced through contingency protocols, cover stories, escape plans, all of which were now compromised by his own haste and arrogance. The room was quiet, sterile, unyielding. Outside, the base moved through routine with the obliviousness of those not yet caught in the spiral of deceit. Inside, Brian was fully aware of the collapse, the irreversible consequences, the certainty that the hierarchy he had tried to manipulate had already begun recalibrating itself without him. The weight of anticipation pressed down in the form of micro-decisions he had failed to foresee, the subtle pause of a finger, the unrecorded call, the timing of a guard's route. Each tiny lapse compounded into a larger failure, and he felt the slow, inexorable tightening of a trap he had designed only for someone else. By the time he closed the locker door, the smell of sweat, metal, and dust seemed heavier. He exhaled slowly, deliberately, trying to reset the rhythm of a body that had betrayed him in instinct. The surveillance photos remained in his hand, immovable in their implication, impossible to ignore, a silent witness to the truth he had tried to bury. The interrogation room was quiet in a way that seemed to compress time. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly, bouncing off scuffed concrete and painted cinder block walls, but the sound was nearly imperceptible beneath the weight of presence in the room. The CIA agent sat across the table, hands folded neatly, eyes fixed on Allison. There was no greeting, no small talk, no perfunctory exchange to test compliance. The atmosphere carried authority unspoken, a baseline metric against which every micro-expression would be measured. Allison sat with the same controlled composure she had maintained throughout the drills and the kill house. Fingers interlaced loosely on the table, wrists relaxed, but every muscle ready to respond if necessary. Her posture conveyed patience, calculation, and the absence of fear. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, reflected awareness, not surprise. The agent's voice cut the silence. "Lieutenant Commander Allison Vance, DevGru, Red Squadron." The words landed like a classification stamp, definitive and exact. Allison exhaled once through her nose, a small release of controlled air, almost imperceptible, but enough to show the subtle shifting of her internal rhythm. The exhalation was not relief, it was acknowledgement of a structure she had operated within, and the confirmation of identity was procedural rather than personal. "I was sent to find the leak," Allison said, voice calm, precise, measured. Turns out it wasn't logistics. Her eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the edge of the table, scanning the paper stacks, the monitor, the minimal instruments in the room. No reaction betrayed urgency, but the tilt of her head, the fraction of a blink, the micro-adjustment of her fingers on the tabletop, all communicated assessment. Sterling, standing near the door, visibly shifted, his face lost color in stages. First the pallor of observation, then the pale shock of realization. The subtle widening of his eyes and the micro-tension along his jawline betrayed him before he could form words. "Brian," Sterling said, his voice low, controlled, but brittle. The agent remained impassive, letting Sterling digest the weight of the revelation. Allison did not flinch, did not interject. Her breathing remained slow, deliberate. The faint creasing at the corner of her mouth suggested nothing. The twitch of a single muscle beneath her eye was the only concession to hidden satisfaction. "He just confirmed it for us," the agent said, voice even, formal, and uninflected. The words carried weight because of precision and timing rather than volume. Every syllable had been chosen, calibrated to remove ambiguity. Sterling's shoulders slumped fractionally. The faint flex in his forearms, the tightening and release of fists at his sides, and the shallow inhalation through his teeth told the story he tried to keep hidden. Betrayal confirmed, chain of command compromised. Micro-expressions passed too quickly for the untrained eye but were clearly noted by Allison. She catalogued them, filing the subtle tension as she would operational intel, converting observation into a vector for future action. Brian's presence, absent physically but echo in the implications of the data, seemed to loom in the space between Allison and Sterling. Every word in the room traced back to the same source, a man who had underestimated discipline, accuracy, and quiet professionalism. The consequences were real, immediate, and measurable. Allison's gaze returned to the agent, no inflection change, no posture shifted. The room contained only the quiet assertion of authority, the acknowledgement of competence, and the subtle but undeniable fallout of the truth laid bare. She did not need to raise her voice, she did not need to gesticulate. The facts themselves were operative. Sterling's eyes flicked briefly to Allison again, scanning for any residual sign of resistance or miscalculation. There was none, only precision, only control, only the silent affirmation that the leak had been located, and the true source of compromise exposed. Allison arrived at the abandoned airfield under a sky so dark it seemed to swallow the horizon. The runway lay cracked and uneven, weeds pushing through fissures in the concrete like stubborn witnesses. The only sounds were the distant hum of cicadas, the faint whistle of wind through broken chain-link fencing, and the soft scuff of her boots on gravel. She moved deliberately, methodical, eyes scanning the shadows for angles, for exposure, for deviation from expectation. Every step was calculated, every motion minimized. She did not impersonate Brian, she had no need to. His methods, his arrogance, the dependence on instinct over observation, she exploited them in full measure without mimicry. The drop had to be replaced, and she executed it with precision. The package was positioned exactly as required, aligned with projected lines of sight and anticipated retrieval. Every imperfection, every anomaly, accounted for in advance. Her breathing was slow, controlled, each exhale measured against heart rate. Fingers brushed against the package, confirming orientation and weight. Her eyes caught the glint of metal in the low moonlight, a subtle reflection that only someone trained to read the world in microcues would notice. Timing, distance, trajectory, all vectors had been calculated. She stepped back, disappeared briefly into shadow, and observed from a concealed position a few meters away. Headlights pierced the darkness, cutting the night into high-contrast beams. Brian's vehicle approached, tires crunching gravel with a rhythm that belied his confidence. His silhouette, barely visible through the glow of lights, exuded intent. He had already assumed the drop would proceed unimpeded. He had already assumed she would not interfere. Brian exited the vehicle with fluid aggression. His first action was preemptive. He fired. A flash in the darkness, the crack of controlled aggression. Reflexively, Allison reacted. Her movements were instantaneous, seamless, and precise. She closed the distance, stepped into the arc of his advance, and engaged his weapon hand in a controlled motion. The sidearm was disarmed in seconds, leverage applied to wrist and elbow with tactical accuracy. Brian's body responded to force applied along biomechanical weak points. Muscle memory was overpowered by calculation and practice strength. His eyes widened just slightly. A flicker of disbelief crossed the corners of his vision before he processed the impossibility. His pulse likely surged, though he betrayed it only through the subtle clenching of his jaw and the brief flex of fingers at his sides. Breath caught and released, just enough to show physiological response. Allison held the weapon, fingers relaxed on the grip, eyes cold, unreadable. Her posture was perfectly aligned, every movement measured against balance and leverage, no overcompensation, no wasted motion. Every micro-expression she displayed was controlled. A slight narrowing of the eyes, the tilt of her chin, the subtle press of lips together, all signaling authority without theatrics. "I'm the janitor," she said, voice low, deliberate, and devoid of inflection. The words carried the full weight of understatement, cutting through his assumptions. The irony was implicit, the authority was absolute. She did not need to raise her voice, nor to explain. The message was clear. Underestimation had consequences, and underestimation of her was fatal to ego, if not to immediate safety. Brian's stance shifted imperceptibly, shoulders squared for resistance, only to collapse in microseconds under the recognition of miscalculation. His gaze flitted to the ground, then back up, searching for leverage he no longer possessed. Every minor twitch, eyebrow, lip, neck muscle betrayed the acknowledgement of defeat, unspoken but undeniable. Allison maintained her hold for a beat longer than necessary, confirming control without exaggeration. Then she stepped back, releasing him only when balance, timing, and tactical advantage were ensured. The drop remained secured, untouched, a silent testament to preparation and anticipation. The night air carried no applause. There was no relief, no celebration. Only the quiet assertion of control, the precise execution of judgment, and the absolute clarity that authority rested not in position, nor in assumptions, but in competence and preparation. The night was fractured by headlights and the distant hum of engines as the Beers convoy arrived. Shadows moved with lethal intent across the cracked concrete of the abandoned airfield. Figures emerged from vehicles, rifles slung, eyes scanning the darkness. Their presence was immediate, deliberate, and deadly, armed mercenaries trained to respond to threat vectors with precision, but unaware that the apex of competence had already positioned itself in opposition. Allison's boots crunched softly against gravel as she moved into cover, using the cracked concrete barriers and derelict cargo crates as concealment. Every motion was minimal, deliberate, calculated to reduce exposure. Her eyes flicked from muzzle flash to muzzle flash, reading trajectories, angles of engagement, wind direction, and cover shadows simultaneously. Each exhalation was measured. Her pulse maintained a constant rhythm, despite the sudden eruption of kinetic chaos around her. Gunfire erupted, metallic and sharp. Sim rounds echoed differently in the cavernous spaces, bouncing off barriers and fractured walls. Dust and debris rose, clouds illuminated briefly by muzzle flash. She ducked, pivoted, repositioned, eyes never leaving the primary target zone. Each shot she observed informed her next move, trajectory, displacement, environmental variables. She catalogued the enemy's spacing, marking points where suppression would be most effective, noting body alignment, and estimating reflex times. "You want redemption," Allison shouted, voice cutting across the night like a scalpel, precise and commanding. Her words were not a challenge, they were a vector, directing focus, channeling instinct. Brian flinched visibly, his jaw tightening, a micro-expression betraying the split between hesitation and compliance. He knew he should resist, he wanted to resist. But her authority, silent and exacting, imposed itself over his impulses. He obeyed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his posture adjusted, his eyes flicked to the wind flags she had monitored earlier, and he began to call conditions. Wind left to right, full value, 15, he said, voice tight, unsteady, carrying the numbers as though confessing to a command he no longer fully controlled. The words were precise, calculated for ballistic compensation, yet punctuated by the tremor of reluctance. Allison exhaled, raised her weapon to a stabilized cheek weld, and adjusted her scope with the precision of a surgeon. Every dial, every click, was synchronized with micro-calculations in her mind, distance, wind, target velocity, elevation, and mirage effect. Her breathing slowed further, heart rate steady, muscles taut but unyielding. The shot was inevitable, executed with absolute confidence. She fired. The recoil pressed against her shoulder, chest rising and falling in perfect rhythm, dust puffed along the flight path. The round traveled with a near-silent precision over the dimly lit field, cutting across shadows, guided by calculations honed over thousands of practice shots. The enemy sniper collapsed were calculated, incapacitated instantly. Brian's eyes widened, subtle muscle twitches betraying shock as he registered the outcome. The suppression he had anticipated, the control he had assumed, had been negated entirely by Allison's calculation and execution. His micro-expressions betrayed his internal reckoning, disbelief, acknowledgement of skill, and the faint, unavoidable trace of fear. Allison maintained her stance, eyes scanning, surveying the remaining threats. Her posture communicated authority without dramatics. Every micro-movement, finger on trigger, toe-adjusting stance, slight tilt of the head was deliberate, a constant assertion of control. The mercenaries froze in response to the sudden removal of their primary threat, confusion momentarily overriding aggression. The airfield was a tableau of precision and chaos managed, her control absolute. Gunfire subsided, movement ceased, and in the pause, her gaze remained steady, eyes sweeping the environment, calculating next vectors even as the first moments of victory crystallized. Reinforcements arrived in a measured, disciplined flow. Tactical vehicles rolled over the cracked runway, tires crunching gravel with deliberate precision. Operators dismounted silently, scanning sectors with methodical sweeps of their optics. Their gear was immaculate, rifles slung, NVGs mounted but dormant until required. The cadence of their movement was practiced, predictable to a point, but the certainty of their approach underscored the control Allison already exerted over the scenario. Brian stood near the center of the airfield, hands twitching ever so slightly at his sides. His pulse was rapid, betrayed in the subtle quiver of his neck muscles, the barely perceptible clenching of his jaw. Micro-expressions flickered across his face, first disbelief, then frustration, then dawning comprehension of the inevitability unfolding before him. He had tried to manipulate, to mislead, to assert authority by falsifying evidence, but all of it had collapsed in the face of quiet, lethal competence. The cuffs closed around his wrists with a finality that carried weight beyond metal. Brian's arms flexed briefly, a subtle attempt at resistance, yet he offered no further opposition. The micro-adjustment of his shoulders, the twitch of fingers against steel links, betrayed tension that words could not convey. His gaze flicked to Allison, searching for some sign of mercy, some trace of error. There was none. Allison's posture remained immaculate, shoulders relaxed but squared, fingers resting lightly on her utility belt. She scanned the perimeter once, eyes tracking the new arrivals, integrating their positions into the operational picture she had already built. Her breathing was steady, measured. Every micro-movement, slight shift of weight, tilt of the head, tightening of grip on her rifle was deliberate, precise, and necessary. "I recorded everything," she said quietly. The words were soft, carrying no triumph, no accusation, only the irrefutable presentation of fact. Her voice did not waver. The calm certainty embedded within it imposed a weight far heavier than volume alone could deliver. Brian's pupils constricted subtly at the words, a physiological response to comprehension, realization, and the futility of protest. His knees buckled fractionally before she could step toward him, subtle enough to seem incidental, but deliberate in the mind of an observer trained in human kinetics. Brian collapsed fully to the ground, head lowering first, shoulders following, the metallic clink of cuffs against his belt punctuating the moment. There was no scream, no dramatics, only the precise collapse of a man stripped of control, authority, and leverage. Allison remained standing, surveying the environment with a quiet, exacting gaze. The reinforcements had taken positions, scanning, covering, but their actions felt almost ceremonial in the presence of her competence. Every operator's movement, from tactical breathing to micro-adjustments of their optic mounts, fell into rhythm around her already established operational dominion. Her eyes returned briefly to Brian on the ground. There was no gloating, no smirk, no personal satisfaction. Only the absolute clarity of execution, the acknowledgement that a threat neutralized did not require flourish, only precision. The microtension along her jaw eased slightly as she allowed herself the smallest exhale, almost imperceptible, like a valve releasing pressure that had never built. The airfield held the silence of aftermath. Dust settled in the beams of vehicle lights, gravel shifted beneath the operator's boots, and the faint hum of distant engines filled the gaps. In that silence, the absolute difference in competence, preparation, and control was evident without a word spoken beyond Allison's calm declaration. Brian's failure, the collapse of his authority, and the finality of the operation were made manifest in microsignals of physiology and posture rather than spectacle. 3 months had passed, measured not in days or weeks, but in the subtle rhythm of routine, the cadence of duty, and the quiet rebuilding of trust and order. The ceremony was set under crisp, pale sunlight, each element deliberate, from the folding of flags to the alignment of personnel. Allison moved through it with the precision of a seasoned operator, her dress whites immaculate, seams aligned, trident gleaming against the uniform's fabric, catching the sun in a disciplined flash. The insignia on her collar reflected achievement without arrogance, authority without theatrics. Her eyes scanned the formations, catching micro-adjustments in posture, the subtle flex of shoulders, the minute alignment of rifles. Every movement she observed told her more about her subordinates than words ever could. The nervous tightening of fists, the tilt of heads, the precision or lack thereof in salutes. Her own breathing was steady, controlled, shoulders squared yet relaxed, eyes reflecting a calm vigilance honed over years in environments where error was unforgiving. She approached the podium, standing tall yet unassuming, letting the quiet authority inherent in her bearing speak louder than ceremony. When she addressed the gathered personnel, her voice was calm, deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of experience without the need for embellishment. "Respect isn't rank," she said, tone even, eyes scanning the crowd to ensure comprehension beyond hearing. "It's the standard you keep when no one's watching." There was a pause, subtle, measured, allowing the words to sink, the meaning to resonate without force. The ceremony progressed, but Allison's attention was divided, calibrated. She observed interactions, minor deviations in uniform, the twitch of nervous eyes, the fleeting shift of weight from one foot to the other. Each was a metric she catalogued silently, a vector for mentorship, for correction, for reinforcement. Her micro-expressions, slight nods, the barely perceptible tightening of lips, a soft narrowing of eyes communicated approval or guidance without overt instruction. Later, in the armory, Allison knelt beside a struggling private, the young operator attempting to disassemble a rifle. Fingers fumbled, movements jerky, and unfamiliarity with mechanical rhythm apparent. She placed a hand lightly on his forearm, adjusting grip, demonstrating leverage without overt display, letting her touch guide without commandeering. Her eyes caught a micro-error in his wrist alignment, a shift too subtle for casual observation, and she corrected it with the softest motion, thumb pressing gently against the right plane of the receiver. "Too much oil," she said, a faint smile touching her lips, the corners of her eyes crinkling slightly, not in jest but in instruction. "That's why it sticks." Her voice remained calm, precise, almost clinical, yet imbued with the warmth of sheer understanding. She allowed the private to repeat the motion, guiding his muscle memory, reinforcing competence, not fear. The lesson was quiet, absorbed, effective, the hallmark of a mentor who had lived discipline and discretion in equal measure. As the young operator adjusted the rifle, aligning parts with newfound fluidity, Allison allowed herself a single, subtle exhale. It was not relief but acknowledgement, the culmination of patience, of precision, of quiet professionalism shaping the next generation. Her eyes scanned the armory one last time, cataloging shadows, angles, equipment alignment, personnel positioning. Everything was in order, or as close to order as discipline allowed. The day waned, light falling in long shafts across concrete and metal. She stood, shoulders square, eyes reflecting the faint glow of sunset. The trident gleamed, not as a symbol of ego, but of responsibility earned and standards upheld in every unobserved moment. And as she walked past the rows of young operators, leaving the armory and the day behind, the quiet assurance of competence carried her forward, an invitation to those who would follow her path. If you want to see more stories like this, filled with discipline, precision, and real operational insight, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for every release.